Howdy! In this mini lecture, we will discuss environmental ethics and define environmental justice. The student learning objectives of this mini lecture are: characterize the influences of culture and worldview on people's choices, compare the major approaches in environmental ethics, which means you should be able to name the philosophical movement or environmental ethic associated with Muir, Thoreau, Whitman, Emerson, Pinchot, and Leopold, and briefly explain the historical significance of each person. Explain the concept of environmental justice, identify examples of it, and reflect on the connection between environmental justice and the wealth poverty theme. Our culture and worldview influence the decisions we make every day, and these decisions often affect the environment. When we decide as individuals how we will utilize the environment to meet our needs, we often assess costs versus benefits, but our decisions are also influenced by our culture and our worldview. Culture is essentially the wealth of knowledge, beliefs, values, and learned ways of life that a particular group of people share. Your culture, combined with your own personal experiences and your unique circumstances, influence your perception of the world or your worldview. Your worldview, in turn, will influence the decisions you make about how to live your life, which will in turn influence your ecological footprint. The continuum of attitudes toward the natural world can be summarized by three general ethical perspectives: ecocentric, biocentric, and anthropocentric. The general anthropocentric worldview has human-centered or human-focused view of our relationship with the environment. Biocentric and ecocentric worldviews take a broader view of the world compared to the anthropocentric worldview. People with a biocentric worldview believe that certain living things or the biotic realm in general has value and should be protected. For example, biocentrics evaluate actions based off the impacts they have on living things, not just humans. People with an ecocentric worldview believe that all life, human and non-human, has worth. A worldview is how you as an individual perceive and interpret the world around you. Everyone has a worldview, even if you're not aware of it. When you interpret a situation and assess your feelings in response to the situation, but you can't clearly or automatically explain why you feel that way without saying that's just the way the world works, you are expressing some element of your worldview. In many cases, you may not even be aware of your worldview. By stopping, reflecting, and writing your thoughts down, you will become more conscious of your worldview and possibly what caused you to form that worldview. Environmental ethics arose as an academic discipline in the 1970s. However, people have been thinking about the ethical relationships between humans and nature for thousands of years. The most notable first philosopher to write and teach about this topic was Plato. Other noted individuals who helped develop different philosophical movements or environmental ethics were Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, and Aldo Leopold. Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman were all transcendentalists.
Transcendentalism was an idealistic, philosophical, and social movement that developed in New England in the 1830s. Transcendentalists believe that nature is a manifestation of the divine. This movement and philosophy emphasizes the human soul's oneness with nature and God. To them, to be in undisturbed nature was to be with God.
Emerson and Thoreau were philosophers and Whitman was a poet. Whitman is most well known for his classic work, Leaves of Grass. Henry David Thoreau wrote Walden. Interestingly enough, Thoreau was one of the first naturalists as well. In Walden, he chronicles the observations he made while living secluded at Walden Pond in Massachusetts. John Muir was a Scottish immigrant who later made Yosemite Valley and the Sierra Nevada mountains his wilderness home. Today, John Muir is associated with the preservation ethic, which states that the natural world should be protected in its pristine, unaltered state. Muir argued that nature deserves to be protected for its own sake, that nature promotes human happiness and that humans needed both bread and beauty, meaning that people needed both food and nature to play in, pray in, and restore themselves in. John Muir is also well known because he is one of the founders of the Sierra Club. Gifford Pinchot was the first professionally trained American forester. He founded what later developed into the U.S. Forest Service and served as the chief of this service under President Theodore Roosevelt. Pinchot was a firm believer in the conservation ethic, which holds that people should utilize natural resources, but that we have the responsibility to manage these resources wisely and sustainably. Ultimately, this is a utilitarian approach to environmental management, meaning that resources should be allocated to provide the greatest good to the greatest number for the longest period of time. This is very akin to sustainability. Finally, Aldo Leopold was a wildlife manager and an environmental philosopher. Over time, he developed to have a holistic view of humans' relationship with nature. He is best known for developing the land ethic, which is based off of an essay he wrote in 1949. Essentially, this ethic states that healthy ecological systems depend on protection of the interacting parts. In the Sand County Almanac, he wrote that people are a part of the land and members of the same community as other organisms, and as such, we are obligated to treat the land with respect.
Let us now examine another element of environmental ethics, namely how wealth and poverty are intricately connected to environmental issues.
Environmental justice is the idea that all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, social standing, or economic class, should be treated fairly with respect to the environment. The poor often have less access to information about environmental health risks, have less political power to protect their interests, and have less money to spend to avoid risks. Despite progress that has been made, the poor still suffer and many live in substandard conditions. Here are good two examples of a lack of environmental justice. On the left, you see a playground next to an industrial facility piping out fumes. On the right, you see a pair of minority children playing in the rubble of the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Many of the people most affected by the storm were poor and non-white. Here is another example of an environmental injustice. Air pollution you could touch, black mist and soot on everything. This is Ponca City, Oklahoma, home to the Ponca Indian tribe. In this city, a black mist from a carbon plant rained on people, pets, and lawns for so long that residents filed 20 binders of complaints with regulators. A Native American mother had her child ride her bike with training wheels inside to avoid the mist. State inspectors documented the pollution for more than a decade, but levied few financial sanctions against industry. The citizen finally went to court. 4 cases with settlements totaling $20 million were filed. The Ponca tribe of Indians in Oklahoma secured a $10.5 million settlement with the Continental Carbon Company, the world's 4th largest carbon black manufacturer. In 2009, the case was filed in the U.S. District. Citizens pressured courts because government wasn't fully protecting them and industry was unresponsive to their concerns. Sadly, these people had to find justice for themselves. The wealthy often impose pollution on poor. Wealthy companies often pay poor nations to import their waste. Developing nations usually have lax environmental laws and health regulations. The Basel Convention prohibits international export of waste, but trade and illegal dumping still occurs. 169 nations have ratified it to the convention. However, the U.S. has not.
As you consider the Basel Convention and our involvement or lack thereof in it, it might be useful to know that the U.S. is the world's largest exporter of waste.
That concludes the mini lecture on environmental ethics and environmental justice. Please review the weekly outline and complete the activities for this week per the schedule set forth in the outline. Thanks and giggle!